Good afternoon. This is Ann DeSaro. I'm a member of the New York State Coalition for the Aging and coordinator of our fall webinar series, and I want to welcome you to the first one of 4 webinars that the coalition will be presenting between now and the end of the year. We're very pleased to be doing this for a second time this year in collaboration with the New York State Association of Area Agencies on Aging. They're providing our technical support assistance, and we're very happy to have Karen Thornton helping us this afternoon with making all of this possible for us to see and hear today. We're also very pleased that this entire series that we're offering is being done in conjunction with a wonderful organization that's from Pennsylvania called the Professional Care Management Institute. They have many years of expertise of providing technical assistance, professional training to area agencies on aging in Pennsylvania and other human service organizations. So we're very fortunate to have their expertise in doing this training and bringing us these 4 topics that we will be presenting for the rest of December. Today we're doing stress management. That seems appropriate for the world in which we're all working in the not-for-profit and human service delivery area, but it's also the holiday season, which just adds to the stress. So I'm thinking that this will help us professionally as well as personally during December. As we go through our process today, we will be stopping in the middle of the presentation for questions as well as at the end. So please be thinking about your questions, and you can write them in the question box that you will see on the right of your screen, and I will read out those questions when we stop in the middle and at the end. So please write down the question when you think of it. Now let's think very much about, and let me introduce to you Frank Wartz, who's our consultant from the Professional Care Management Institute. We're very fortunate to have Frank. He was a founding member of this organization, and he has 45 years of experience in the aging, health, and social service fields. And as a consultant, he works providing consultation and training on case management, aging-related issues, mental health, housing, quality assurance, management, technology on the regional and national level. And he is presently an assistant professor at Lincoln University in the Masters of Human Service program. I would also like to remind you that this entire session will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the New York State Association of Area Agency website at the end, the conclusion of our presentation today. So if you missed something, you can go back and listen to it again, or you can share it with some fellow employees in your organization. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Frank and get us started on stress managing a balancing act. Thank you, Frank, so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ann, and thank your both associations for providing us the opportunity to present PCMI's stress management program, A Balancing Act. Now, before I start, I should remind all of our participants that even though I have 45 years experience in the field, I'm not as old as that would appear to make me, since I started at a very young age, 15 or so. I would seriously like to point out that we do plan to take a break about halfway through my presentation to answer any questions that you might have. And then again at the end of the presentation, we'll entertain questions according to the time that remains. So please do send your questions as they occur to you to Ann, so that she can present them when the break occurs. The goals for today are fairly straightforward. First, what I would like to do is shift a way that many of us think about stress, and at the same time present what we at PCMI believe is a more functional way of thinking about stress. And secondly, I'd like to make it easier for all of us to find productive ways of managing stress, since I think most of us will agree that stress is always a part of our life, both professional and personal. Our experience at PCMI has been that when we do stress management training programs, almost every person we talk to who attends the session has either taken a stress management program training before, or has written or has read a number of articles that address the area of stress. So for us, as we talk about making things better, the questions that arise for us is, well, why are people continually taking stress management programs, training programs? Didn't the other ones that they have gone through work for them? When we talk to people who attend our training, people tell us very clearly that they are resolved to change what they do around managing stress by coming up with a new type of routine. And what they also report to us is that after a week or so, the routine that they walk away from the training with seems to get tired, and they seem to move further away from it. Now, some of them even identify that the loss of following this new routine often actually produces more stress for them. And then finally, I want to explore briefly the legitimacy of stress management in the workplace. But I'd like to change the perspective to productivity as it's addressed between supervisors and workers. Before moving on, I'd like to present the following story. It's one that PCMI uses quite frequently when working with people on shifting how they think. As you see on the screen, two men were walking along a crowded sidewalk in a downtown business area. Suddenly, one exclaimed, "Listen to the lovely sound of that cricket." But the other could not hear the cricket. He asked his companion how he could detect the sound of a cricket amid the din of the people and the traffic. The first man, who was a zoologist, had trained himself to listen to the voice of nature, but he didn't explain. He simply took a coin out of his pocket and dropped it to the sidewalk, whereupon a dozen people began to look around to find what was dropped. "We hear," he said, "what we listen for." Now, of course, the moral of the story, as it applies to stress management, is that we have the ability to manage many things. We do this in many places in our lives. We manage households, our wardrobes, our lives in many different ways. And we've learned to do this over time. We already have the skill sets to manage stress. We just need to listen to a slightly different sound and perhaps approach stress in a different way. Now, let me begin by making it clear that there is no magic in the approach PCMI is presenting here today. It does take a commitment to change and a willingness to make an investment in ourselves. After all, we are training ourselves to hear something different than what we already hear. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the prevalence of stress. Over half of all working adults say they are concerned about stress in their lives. In addition, almost 47% of all Americans say the same thing. Now, what's important here is that they're just not saying that they experience stress. What is really important here is that they're identifying that they experience enough stress to be labeled as a concern to them. I think it is important to note that as recently as 2011, there is evidence that stress levels in most Americans is on the rise. And we're talking about moderate to high levels of stress. 44% of people surveyed say they are experiencing more stress than they were 5 years ago. We also know something about the major causes of stress. The data you see represented here was collected in 2011 by the American Psychological Association as part of its Stress in America project. I guess it should come as no surprise that in these economic times with high unemployment and tighter lending restrictions, money would be the #1 concern identified by folks. But a very close second behind money, work is a major cause of stress. Now, given the fact that most of us are not in a position to do much about the money we or others make, we're going to focus in this training on work-related stress. We will, however, be keeping in mind that most of us can't separate our stress into nice, neat little categories. Those things that stress us tend to overlap. So we'll be sensitive to this, but attempt to keep our focus work-related. Now, regardless of the sources of stress, it is important to recognize the signs of stress. That is, it is important to be able to see or identify stress in ourselves and in others. Today we're going to review 4 areas where one can see indicators of stress: the physical, emotional, intellectual, and behavioral perspectives. Let's begin by looking at the physical signs of stress that show up in many different ways. Many of us have experienced headaches or fatigues, and some of us even chronic exhaustion. Some of us experience frequent illness such as colds, especially when others seem to be able to avoid them. Some of us experience insomnia and an inability to quickly fall asleep or sleep soundly. This list contains many of the physical signs, but remember, it's only a partial list. For some people, stress shows up as a nervous facial tic or even a rash. Personally, I experienced this the other day when a person I was working with came into me and showed me a rash that had just developed on his body and connected that rash to significant stress that he had with his immediate supervisor. So it's important for us to begin to know and be aware of how stress shows up in ourselves physically. In addition to physical signs of stress, as we know, there are emotional signs. Often, emotional signs develop slowly enough that it's hard to see them until stress is near critical level. But if we can come to recognize or have others around us tell us when they see these signs, there could be a good chance we can catch our stress early enough to make it less difficult to manage. So we all need to keep a lookout for negative, cynical attitudes, a lack of emotion, or a lack of motivation. When our tempers get shorter, or when we worry excessively, or lack a drive, or initiate feelings of jealousy or suspicion. These are all warning signs that deserve our serious attention. Now, not unlike emotional signs of distress, intellectual signs can creep up on us slowly too. Forgetfulness, inattention to detail. For some of us, an inability to concentrate, or maybe even take longer than normal to think something through, or have more difficulty solving everyday problems. These could all be potential signs of stress. Finally, we have the behavioral signs. As with the others, it might take a combination of input or feedback from others, as well as our own awareness to see these signs. So we all have to be on the lookout for working harder with fewer productive results when you are avoiding some tasks, when you are short-tempered, if our drinking goes up, if competing with others when no competition is warranted. Interesting to me, usually this occurs when people are driving. They get very competitive when there's really no reason to do so. In addition to our informal methods of recognizing signs of stress, there are some specific tools that can be used to measure stress. They range from the popular and easy-to-use stress vulnerability scale, developed by Miller and Smith, to the occupational stress inventory. Now, the occupational stress inventory is a more comprehensive and complex tool. It is, however, highly reliable and a research-validated tool. This is a tool that PCMI uses when asked to measure stress levels within an organization or agency. Additionally, much of the theory and research used to validate the occupational stress inventory forms the foundation for how we're going to approach thinking about stress today. Many of you have probably seen the Miller and Smith tool. It looks like this. It's quite short and it's often used. Typically what happens is a person receives a score of 20 to 100. Any score over 50 addresses the validity or the vulnerability to stress. Based on this evaluation, people would identify the potential reasons for stress and begin to put together a plan to address it. I think the next point that needs to be addressed is that not all stress is bad. In fact, I believe most of us know that some stress can be a very positive thing. We can, however, think of stress as either or. Stress really occurs along a continuum. It can range from having very little or no stress all the way to having a significant level of stress. Let's take a look at the continuum. No stress would seem like the ideal state for many people. However, I'm not completely sure that it actually exists. But most of us can think of times when we feel less stress or somewhat stress-free. The next level is constructive anxiety. This is when there is just enough stress to act as a motivator. I think it typically shows up when people have thoughts like, oh, I better get that check in the mail before the bill's overdue. Or, I need to get this report done, it's due tomorrow. This kind of stress seems not to overwhelm us. Rather, it spurs us on to start and complete something. The next level on the continuum is mild anxiety. It's a step higher than constructive anxiety in that there is a slightly higher level of concern. By that I mean the stakes or outcome of a given situation might be a little higher. That is, we have more or less to gain. Yet at the same time, this level of stress is not overwhelming to us, but is a growing concern. Now we move on to a much higher level of stress, where actual performance begins to suffer. This we term significant stress. At this level, stress is having enough of a negative impact that we are not producing or functioning at the level we should. This level of stress can be overwhelming. It can have a negative impact on our overall judgment or even on our health. At this level, there is real danger in not addressing the stress. Now, moving on, we are now at the point where one of the key concepts for managing stress comes into play. That is, learning to keep things in balance. I think most of us would agree that there will always be things that stress us. Most of us will never and might not want to be completely stress-free. That's just not a realistic approach. What makes this model so appealing is its simplicity. If you want to keep stress from becoming significant stress that has a definite impact on your ability to function and maybe even your health, you must learn to keep things in balance. More precisely, you must learn to balance stressors with those things that help you cope. Now we're going to look at this in a little more detail. The approach we suggest is that there are three important dimensions to consider when addressing stress. First, you come to understand that there are two types of stressors that we need to examine in a work situation. The first are those stressors completely related to work. The second are personal stressors or strains. These are the negatives in our balance model. We'll get into more detail on these shortly. The other side of the balance model are the positive coping resources. That is, the thoughts, skills, ideas, behaviors, and resources people have available to them to counterbalance stress. So now it's time to look at each of these dimensions in more detail. It's important to be able to label what is or can take place in each one. I'll start with work-related stressors. I'll focus on 5 key stressors from the work environment. These are the ones that research has shown to be most important to understand and manage. After describing all 5, we'll illustrate each with a case example. The first related work stress is role overload, which is when the demands of a given job role exceed the resources available. Now, I think we all would agree that logic would suggest that it's very hard to accomplish something if you don't have the resources needed to do the job. The resources, by the way, can either be internal, such as right information or knowledge or attitude, or external resources, such as equipment or materials. The second work-related stressor is role insufficiency. That is, when there is a mismatch between the person's education, skills, and/or experience and what the job requires. Now remember, this mismatch can go in both directions. That is, sometimes the person has less skill, experience, and education than the job requires, and sometimes the person has considerably more than the job requires, which can also be a mismatch. The third of our work-related stressors is role ambiguity. And this occurs when an individual is not clear about what is expected of them or what it is that they are supposed to do. And they have no way of knowing if they're being successful or not. The fourth work-related stressor is role boundary. This is the extent that people in a given role experience demands from different people or places from throughout the agency. For them, it becomes hard to know where one should place his or her allegiance. The fifth work-related stressor is responsibility. This identifies when people feel a very high level of responsibility for the work completed by others and/or for the safety of others under his or her watch. Now, that we have the definition or a kind of a concept for these work-related stressors, let's move on to examine some case examples for each. Role overload. Let's take an example where Carol, an intake worker who has too much on her plate right now. She is used to a fast pace as an intake worker. Recently, however, she has been asked to fill in for another worker, and she has been assigned to take a course on using new software for her computer. Now, for Carol, as each new thing is added, Carol is likely to feel more stress. Role overload becomes an issue when the number of things reaches a point where Carol feels no longer that she can adequately manage them all. Let's look at role insufficiency. The position for which Kenzo was originally hired has been eliminated. The agency offered him a new position that does not require his level of skill, etc. Because of the poor economy, he took the job. Since his move to the new position, his stress level has gone up. Keep in role again, as we mentioned, that role insufficiency can also occur when people have fewer skills and education than are needed for a job, or too many and too much education. The issue is that there is a mismatch between what the person can do and what the job requires. The greater the mismatch, the higher the likelihood that stress becomes serious enough to create problems with performance. Role ambiguity. Ellen was hired when her company was making an effort to increase its workforce diversity. Since being hired 3 weeks ago, she has had 4 different projects to which she has been assigned, none of them permanent. She has yet to receive a job description and does not know what her real role is within the department. In relation to role ambiguity, Ellen does not have a clear idea of what she is supposed to be doing on a routine basis. And it gets more complicated for her because eventually the person doesn't know what she has to do to be successful. It's hard to master a new position if the components of the position are not clear. It is often expressed in terms like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. I know what my job really is. Role boundary. Margie has been hired as a temporary employee while 2 other individuals are out on leave. She does not know what she will be doing from day to day. Each day it seems as if she has a different supervisor and is often given conflicting directions from each. She doesn't even know who she reports to except for the daily supervisor. Role boundary conflicts have primarily to do with getting too many different sets of directions from too many different people. This can easily occur when someone has multiple supervisors, when someone is assigned to more than one unit, or when assigned to provide support to a group of people. The daily stress of trying to figure out who and what gets priority can be extremely difficult. Responsibility. Judith feels a tremendous amount of responsibility. She supervises 4 new workers, all of whom work with the frail community-based elderly. We've probably all had this experience. Recently, she has been asked to spend 2 weeks working with monitors from the state government going over the records. She is very concerned that she may not be giving her new employees the level of clinical supervision they need. Key to this area is the feeling of overwhelming responsibilities that are not being adequately met. In this case, Judith believes that the level of support, attention, and investment she makes is not sufficient, and that she will be responsible if something goes wrong. At this point, what I'd like to do is to break for some questions before we move into the specific model of balancing this work and personal perspective that comes when we attempt to manage stress.
Thank you, Frank. I have 3 questions that are all kind of related to some process stuff here, so I'll try to cover the answers to that. The questions have to do with whether they can not only listen to the recording but see the slides after this presentation is over for a variety of reasons here. And the answer to that is yes. This presentation, audio and visually, will be on the following website, www.agingnewyork.org. And it'll be posted there today. So anybody who wants to see not only the audio part of this, but see the slides. Some of you came in late and wanted to see what started before that, and others have staff members who they think would benefit from this and weren't able to join the call today. So with those, I don't have any other questions that anybody has written. If you have something that occurs to you, you can put it in the question box right now. And here's one. What can you do if you get conflicting instructions from the same supervisors over a period of time? It's not easy to say to the supervisor that yesterday you told me X and today you want me to do Y.
Well, I think what I would do is not address the issue with either one of the supervisors, but try to schedule a meeting with both supervisors around a specific performance issue and see if they can address the performance from their different perspectives. And you'll see that when we get into the second part of the presentation that we address this at least in a general mood.
Frank, I think it's important to tell you that this question we talked about is the same supervisor giving conflicting instructions.
I'm sorry. I thought it was two different supervisors, like in role ambiguity.
Yeah.
No, in that situation, I think we have to turn around and use the skills that we use when we're working with our older folks or other consumers that we've worked with. And I think the critical notion there is to try to get some clarity on whether or not the supervisor sees a conflict in the instructions that he or she is offering. Sometimes people don't see the conflict because they're under such stress that they can't recognize it. In that situation, I think what I would do is try to clarify with them whether or not they see it. If they don't, based on what the personal relationship is, either I would understand better that they don't even see the conflict that they're offering, or I do see that they understand the conflict and that's just the way they're making my life more miserable. Or if it really is important enough for the agency, I think that the worker would have to take responsibility to go above that supervisor and try to resolve it at that level. If not, what's going to happen is, and the literature is pretty clear on this, that the individual employee over time is going to have stress. The stress is going to turn into burnout, and they're going to have to leave the agency, or something significant is going to have to take place in the agency to resolve the issue anyhow. So in many cases, I think it's better for us to confront it than just to walk away from it.
And Frank, it occurred to me as you're talking about the first two roles, where you really, the role overload and the role insufficiency, really has a conflict between the job, the needs of the job, and the person's background, either too much or too little. That seems to me that that's an important role for both the supervisor as well as the individual to recognize, see if they can help better use a talented employee someplace else, or move one who's not helping you out and is getting frustrated. So can you kind of give us some thoughts from not the individual standpoint, but from a supervision standpoint?
Sure.
In that?
No, I think that's a great point. One of the things I would say is, from my experience in doing a lot of supervision, that one of the principal roles, I think, of the supervisor is to get an understanding of where the person is in relation to their education and theories and understanding of the subject that they're dealing with. Also have a sense of their skill set, and at the same time have a sense of how emotionally they deal with the issues that they're confronted with every day. So I think part of the supervisory vision process should be that the supervisor and the worker attempt to enhance the worker's either knowledge of the theories needed, or teach them and practice with them specific skills, or help them to identify what it is that throws them off balance emotionally when something happens in working with a client. if the supervisor determines that the worker really needs a lot of additional information or a lot of additional training in the skills realm, then I think it might be time to either move the person to a new position and then gradually have them go from that position and move up to another position, or figure out what kind of educational opportunities are available for the worker, either in terms of formal education or outside training programs. For instance, right now I'm teaching in a Master's in Human Services program at Lincoln University. And many of our students are coming there because their supervisors have identified to them that there's areas which are lacking in either both knowledge or skills, and that this program, the Masters of Human Services program, will give them access to that knowledge or that set of skills. And so the students are coming because of the advice of the supervisor, and when they do get the degree, or even if they don't get the degree, if they go through a certain part of the program and drop out, when they go back to their agency, they've reported to us that at least they have more skills and a better perspective on the job from their experience with the program.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? If I don't see some here, we'll turn it back to Frank to go through the rest of his slides, and then we'll have opportunities for questions at the end again. So be thinking about what he's saying here, and if there's something that would help you better understand or something to help you solve situations that you're experiencing in your place of work.
Okay.
Okay, Frank.
Well, thank you for the questions. And now let's change the perspective a little bit. Remember, we were talking before about the workload issues relating to stress, and we talked about role overload, role insufficiency, ambiguity, boundary, and feeling of responsibility. Now what we like to do is like to look at the personal strains, because we said we were going to look at both work and personal strains. Personal strains are those things that occur at an individual's level. So they're very specific to each of us as we go through our normal work experience. Some of them may, but many of them may not directly relate to work. But as we know, they have a tremendous impact on both the quality and the quantity of the work that we produce. So for instance, someone, and I think many of the women in the audience probably have the experience of taking care of an older relative and yet have to go to work for 40 or 60 hours a week, and therefore they're constantly trying to address the quality and the quantity of their work. Now, Elaine Brody has identified that as the woman in the middle syndrome. So the first thing we want to do in understanding personal strains is we want to look at the physical strain. And the physical strain includes primarily two areas. The first relates to our health. So any illness or health issues, especially chronic ones, can contribute to stress. We all know that. Things like pain or chronic headaches are examples of this. Many of us, for instance, have chronic back pain, or in our present age, many of us have carpal tunnel syndrome. The other part of physical strain has to do with poor self-care habits. So for an example, many of us drink too much alcohol, or we don't consistently follow the health care regimen that's been assigned, like stretching for our back problem. Some of us do not comply with recommended therapies that we've been given. For instance, the proper use of prescription drugs. And general health-seeking behaviors also belong in this category. Now, there's also interpersonal strain. And this exists when an individual has few or inadequate meaningful relationships. In other words, when many of us are isolated. And because we work in aging, many of us understand the significance of this, because when we see our older people, we realize that those who are most isolated have many cases of much more significant issues. So if an individual has inadequate meaningful relationships, what they're confronted with is a lack of the ability to be refueled or replenished or validated, or help them to address some of the life's challenges and disappointments that confront them. Now, many of us, one of our heroes, because we're in the human service field, is Carl Rogers. And as Carl Rogers would say, we all need some level of unconditional positive regard. We all need people in our lives who accept us for who we are. When people are without this, they are missing a very important coping resource. So while it might take time to develop, having these kinds of relationships have shown to be extremely valuable in managing stress. Remember, previously we've said that sometimes stress needs to be identified by feedback from other folks. If there's not a significant, decent relationship, it's going to be very difficult to accept or to get the kind of feedback we need that relates to stress. A psychological strain is a problem when the issues people are dealing with surface often enough that it wears them down when they try to manage them. Eliminating this kind of stress can be difficult to do and often requires assistance from trained others. That is, sometimes we need counseling, we need talk therapy, or we need understanding, skilled friends. And some of us even need drug therapies to assist us. For example, a person with bipolar disorder may be able to manage his or her condition without drug therapy, but it does require extremely understanding friends who have knowledge about the disorder and how it impacts their friend for this to take place. Okay, so this has been an overview of one way to describe the major personal strains that are in the balancing mix. Remember, the extent to which one can reduce one of these strains is the extent to which it will help shift stress levels in a positive direction. So let's move on to the third and final dimension, coping resources. One way to think about coping resources is to think about how you like to play. What are the leisure time activities that are rewarding to you? What provides pleasure? Is it writing? Is it knitting? Is it exercise? Is it listening to music? How do we like to derive our pleasure? How do we play? The next coping mechanism is self-care. Some people see meditation and exercise as the stereotypical models of self-care. But there are many other things that contribute. For instance, making sure one gets adequate sleep, one eats a healthy diet, one avoids harmful substances. These are all significant. Self-care means just that the individual is doing those things that he or she needs to do to stay physically healthy, emotionally balanced, and intellectually sharp. So one might include watching less TV as a self-care measure. Conversely, if one uses a half hour of silly TV programming to reduce stress, this too could be a form of self-care. In terms of relaxation, there are almost countless methods that can help one achieve a state of relaxation. For some, it might be meditation. For others, it might be listening to a favorite piece of music. Others might find relaxation with a warm bubble bath, or even by getting a personal massage. If something is relaxing to you, you really usually know it. If the same thing that relaxes other causes tensions for you, you likely know this too. So this part of self-care really can't be as prescriptive as saying eat nutritious foods. It really must become very individualized. Now, some of us are very rational creatures, and use of our cognitive skills can help reduce stress considerably. It can give those of us who use our rational skills a high sense of control. Social supports. I think this one speaks for itself. It is important to have others in your life on whom you can count. It's where we get a lot of our unconditional trust and concern. To bring balance, our model says we reduce stressors and increase coping mechanisms. Simple, isn't it? Not really, but let's take a look at it in more detail. Carol, in the example we spotted earlier, had 3 big stressors: fast-paced, filled in for another worker, and the class for new software. She also had 3 strong coping resources. For now, Carol is managing her stress because self-care, getting more sleep, don't skip planned workouts, and having dinner with friends kept her in balance. If she reduces her coping resources, the stressors will shift her balance in a negative way. If she reduces stressors, coping resources will shift her balance in a positive way. If she adds a coping resource, it will shift her balance in a positive way. Now again, there's multiple ways of shifting the balance between sensors and coping resources. And in this last slide, we see that an additional way of adjusting the balance would be to bring additional coping resources to the mix. For example, Carol might want to remind herself that she often thinks about things in ways that are not rational or productive. We all know that this is what Albert Ellis called crooked thinking. Let me give you 2 classic examples. We can sometimes think in terms of all or nothing. So Carol might think, I never get this right. If that were true, then Carol is destined to feel that she will always fail, not a desirable feeling if one wants to avoid stress. She would be better served to think, I don't get this right as often as I would like. This thought opens the possibility that she can get it right. Another example that Ellis gives us is mental filters. Mental filters occur when you dwell on one aspect of something and don't see it in its entirety. For example, if Carol thinks, you know what, it's like around here, they keep piling it on and piling it on, she's guilty of focusing on the negative and maybe ignoring the positives. She might be better served if she thought, they have faith that I can do this extra work. Even if the work has reached the point where it is too much, Carol benefits by seeing the positive side of the situation and not just the negative. Over the years, PCMI, we have had many individuals ask how stress management can be addressed directly in the workplace. From their perspective and from our experience, there seems to be a reluctance to openly deal with stress from both the supervisory and worker perspectives. Supervisors are fearful of getting into personal territory that might seem too invasive to workers. And workers have expressed concern about putting themselves at risk with too much disclosure. So our experience has been that when performance is suffering because of stress-related issues, little is actually done. We found, however, that if the focus stays on performance from both the supervisor and worker's end, stress can be and is a legitimate issue. I want to use a case study to illustrate this point. Keep in mind that the case study is built on the premise of the supervisory coaching model for addressing performance issues. The case study. Ruth is a lead secretary in her agency. She has been a real asset to the organization for well over 8 years. Recently, Ruth has started a program to help her quit smoking. Many of us have been there. And she is finding this is much more difficult than she anticipated. So something she is doing to improve her self-care is actually causing even more stress right now. While Ruth is 2 weeks into the program, she is finding it hard to keep her mind off smoking. At the same time, the agency has hired 2 new secretaries, and Ruth is responsible for their training and supervision. Both of these individuals are inexperienced and will need a fair amount of supervision. Ruth has indicated to her boss that she should not worry about the mistakes that these new hires have made. She said that she will take responsibility for their performance, correct their errors, and make sure they are adequately trained. Ruth has some concern about her ability to handle all this, as does her boss. For the first time in her career, Ruth has raised her voice with one of the new employees and came close to completely losing her temper completely. Okay, we can see the stressors for Ruth: normal workday stress, psychological strain of quitting smoking, and the responsibility for 2 new employees. This is typical of the kind of scenarios that are presented by people when we do stress management training in a live classroom setting. What we're going to do now is look at this from Ruth's perspective and her boss's perspective. Let's start with Ruth's boss. Ruth's boss does not need to be fearful of addressing what is taking place if she addresses it from the perspective of performance. That is, there has been an increased number of errors recently, and Ruth has interacted with a new employee in a way that, if it continues, could lead to the creation of a hostile work environment, something the agency is very mindful of and works hard to avoid. Granted, the boss may see that stress is the likely cause of the performance issue, but it is important to keep the focus on performance. With that said, if Ruth's boss uses a coaching model, the issue of stress should be uncovered in a way that it can be successfully addressed. You might expect the dialogue in this situation to be like this. Boss: Ruth, I'm glad you're able to meet with me now. Please come on in, sit down, be comfortable. I wanted to talk with you about some changes in performance, changes in your performance over the past week. You've been such an asset to us for how long now? 8 years? Ruth: Yes, it was 8 years last month. Boss: I thought so. Well, that's part of what has concerned me. I've not known you to have performance slips like this in the past. There have been more errors in work from you and your people than usual, and for the first time ever, I heard you raise your voice with a new hire. Can you tell me what's going on? Ruth: Yes. I know my new people have made some errors that I would have typically caught and corrected before being sent out. I take full responsibility for this. I should have checked things more carefully. I won't let it happen again. Okay, what I'd like us to do is to step back for a moment here and address what will likely happen if the supervisor stops the conversation at this point. If the discussion ends here, another stressor has been added to Ruth's list. That is her commitment to take even more responsibility. So now, instead of just 3 major stressors, Ruth has added this 4th. And the real problem here is that it does not address how she will do this, and she's already struggling with the current demands. So let's go back and pick up the conversation between Ruth and her boss. Boss: Ruth, I'm also concerned about raising your voice too. I'm really interested in knowing what is going on so that we can find a way to get performance back to where it belongs. Ruth: I know, I promise, I'll take care of it. Boss: I believe you mean that, but I also know that if you were able to address these issues, they probably wouldn't have happened in the first place. I'm really interested in both of us coming up with a plan to get things back on track. So what do you think is happening? Okay, so now we're going to shift a moment to what Ruth might be thinking. From what people have shared with us in training, it would be very possible for Ruth to wonder how safe or appropriate it would be to talk about how stressed she is. She doesn't want to appear to be making excuses, nor does she want to appear inadequate and taking care of her personal business. And that's how Ruth is likely to see it. Stress is a personal business. Well, from a performance perspective, it really isn't just personal business. The stress is having an impact on her performance. And it's important for all of us to remember that everyone experiences stress. It's a normal experience, and most of us have had and will continue to have times where stressors and coping resources are out of balance. The smart things to do is to recognize that as a normal process, not as a weakness or some form of inadequacy. It is when we can make the connection between performance and stress, knowing that everyone needs to adjust his or her balance when it comes to stress, that progress can be made. If Ruth feels secure in knowing that she can get things back in balance and that there is no punishment or negative consequences for doing this, there are all kinds of possibilities. Ruth, with her boss's support, can build a plan to get things back in balance. Let me give you just one example of how this might look. Keeping in mind that balance can be achieved by adding coping resources or taking away stressors, consider what might happen if Ruth was only training one new person instead of two. Perhaps there is another experienced secretary who would actually benefit from the experience of training a new secretary. And clearly, Ruth should be relieved of her commitment to take even more responsibility. She needs to be reminded that she is already seen as a responsible person. This is only about improving performance. Then if we can shift to coping resources, we can see that something as simple as extending her breaks by 5 minutes for the next 2 weeks could allow her to reduce stress through exercise and this mini respite. In our field, we all know how important respite is for many of our informal caregivers. It's important that we recognize this for ourselves too. Ruth can also be reminded and encouraged to employ even more self-care habits while she's quitting her smoking. She might find that dinner with a good friend could help. She should also employ more rational thinking and not allow crooked thinking to have a subversive impact on her. She might want to simply post notes on her desk, perhaps with statements like, "I can do this. It's a challenge, and I know how to deal with challenges. I'll get through this." Finally, depending on the relationship, the boss may be able to provide some level of support by making time to check in with Ruth over the next 2 weeks or so. Obviously, these are just suggestions based on a hypothetical case. But I want to stress that the importance of seeing stress management as bringing things back into balance is critical. Recognize stress and be aware of the level of impact it's having on your performance. Look for the emotional, behavioral, intellectual, physical signs of stress. Know that everyone has stress knock them out of balance at some point in their lives. The goal is to bring things back into balance. Reduce stressors if and where you can, and add coping resources when needed. At this point now, I would like to entertain questions before we end our session.
Thank you so much, Frank. We do have a question that's come in during the second session, and while I present that, if any of the rest of you have thoughts or questions you'd like to share, we would love to share it with the group. This question says, would this whole discussion around Ruth, would this change anything if Ruth's work employer was the one who wanted her to quit smoking? As an example, that the employer was going smoke-free. Does that kind of shift the balance to any in that scenario that you just presented?
Oh, I think it definitely would, because in that case, then I think both the supervisor and the worker would have to be aware that because this is a demand rather than something that is self-motivated, that there would be extra pressure and it would undo the balance more so. So in that case, the supervisor would probably have to create inside the work environment more supports and more coping mechanisms for the individual to get through the stop smoking issue. That's why I think in most organizations, if they have a stop smoking campaign, they usually try to do that with groups of people, where the people who are going through the process become supports for each other while they're entertaining the stress of quitting smoking. And as an ex-smoker, I know that's a tremendous amount of stress.
to come in either way. In this discussion that you've had about Ruth and sitting down with the supervisor who's responding to what they see in the workplace, and your focus on keeping it at performance, it is not, how much can the supervisor bring in and in getting to know their employee, knowing somewhat about their own personal life, so that they can be helpful in talking about what are those personal stressors that might be there, and acknowledging them. Is that appropriate, or and if so, how can that be done without seeming to be over the line between the supervisor and the employee?
Well, I think what the optimum situation would be is if the supervisory relationship was one that had some quality. What I mean by that is that the supervisor's mentality was to constantly be enhancing the skills, the attitudes, the knowledge of the worker, and would see that as her primary focus. And at the same time, the worker believed that the supervisor was in fact being supportive to her or him, and that the supervisory conferences were such where there was not a high level of negative feedback. Then I think when we focus on production, I think from both sides of the equation, the supervisor and the worker, the things that are necessary to balance the coping to the stress are much more easily discussed. I think the issue gets out of hand when either the supervisor pushes too hard in trying to get into the personal arena of the worker, or where the worker has such feelings, negative feelings about the supervisor, that there's kind of a hold, there's like a battle at the pass there, and what's needed to be communicated to each other simply is not able to take place. So I think that the way to get to this point is that there has to be some discussion between workers and supervisors that specifically discuss the quality or the type of relationship that both of the individuals would like to have, since the supervisory relationship is so critical to what we do in human services and in social work. And I think that's the critical thing. I think that probably what we see in many agencies is because of the push and the change in the field that supervision sometimes gets relegated more to the administrative side of our agency's practice and not to the professional and personal development side that should take place between the supervisor and the worker. So I think if the workers and supervisors really make a concerted effort to address some of that professional development side, that has a tremendous impact on keeping people in the fields that they feel that they should be in, yet at the same time providing the kind of information that's necessary to deal with really the stress that is almost, in my mind at least, a necessary part of our profession.
We have another question here. At what point do you say maybe this isn't the right environment for me? And when interviewing for other jobs, how do you respond to questions about why a job didn't work out without making yourself look inadequate for future jobs? And lastly, is there a way to determine before you accept a job whether or not the environment will be a good fit?
Okay. I think that many times when we apply for jobs, we don't spend enough time researching what the job is really like. And by that I mean, what really happens on a day-to-day basis when someone goes out and fulfills the role that they're applying for. So my sense is, I think that people should do a couple things. One, I think they should really look at the job description and see if they can understand, at least from their perspective, what the items on that job description entail and how they can connect what they understand, what they've experienced, the skills that they know they have. How would they fit into this job environment? The second thing I think that people need to do is they really should interview or at least talk to people who are doing the job, but talk to people who are doing the job, the same job, in different agencies to see how broadly the job is considered and what are different perspectives relating to the job. Because when we do that, we begin to get some sense of the organizational culture. Because typically when we talk about what we do in an organization, we not only communicate a little bit of ourselves, but we communicate to others the context within which we work. So I think in terms of applying for a job, I think there are two significant things. The question about if I leave a job and go to another, I think one should address the shift in light of very specific elements that either address the job skills requirements or organizational climate. So for instance, some organizations are really much more laissez-faire. In other words, the supervisors in the agencies hire people that they think have enough experience, and basically they're not very demanding in terms of when things are done, but things always get done because that's the kind of attitude that exists in the agency. And other agencies are really very prescribed, that things have to be done by 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the schedule has to be provided to the supervisor before you go out to do visits. I think the kind of climate that we work in has a lot to do with whether we're successful or not. So I think when we go from one agency to another, I think if we can address it in terms of how maybe our skills weren't used, or maybe it's an environment that really doesn't lend to our style of working. Let me give you an example. A young man was talking to me the other day, and he worked in a mental health center, and he was working in a new program where they were taking people from mental institutions and placing them in the community, and the idea was to provide the services that they needed, even though they were severely mentally ill, in community-based settings. And in talking to him, he loved the job. And in talking to staff, he was great at the job. Now, he had a boss, and the boss had a peculiarity. In order to keep order in the agency, what she would do is she would take one person a week and identify all the negative things that they did for a week. Now, what happened after 6 or 8 months of this person realized that this wasn't the job. And so what they did is they applied for another job inside the same organization, because it was a large organization, that dealt with different clients, different types of clients. So when he went to interview for that job, he didn't focus on the types of clients. He told about how he liked working with the clients, that his skills were fit for the clients, but he talked about an organizational climate where things were not consistent, where things went up and down. And that's what he was looking for. He was looking for a place to practice the skills and exercise the information that he had in a setting that was conducive for him to be the best he could be. And he got the new job, and he was telling me yesterday that the job is just amazing. In fact, so much so that they're going to offer him a promotion that will double his salary within the next 3 months. So again, I think it's how we sell ourselves. If we see it as negative, if we don't understand why it is that we're changing jobs, then we probably don't have a positive way to sell it. But if we really have analyzed what it is and why it is that we're struggling and stress is overwhelming us, then I think we have some very interesting things to report to the new potential job.
Frank, thank you very much. This has been very, very helpful, I think, for all of us. And Frank now has a slide up that allows you to send additional questions to him, and with the message that's up there on the screen. So please do take advantage of this resource that we've had today. And I want to remind you that we are just on the beginning of a series of 4 of these webinars. And next week on the 10th, which is Monday, we have change management, which is being brought to us by Bradley Levine. And then Frank is back talking to us on December the 14th about time management, kind of related to stress management. If we don't manage our time, our stress goes up, I'm sure. And then on the 17th, we are talking about person-centered planning with Brad Levine again. And the person-centered planning is really focused on helping us all look at the clients that we deal with and not so much the forms we have to fill out, I think. So it's you know, just looking at the way we deliver services perhaps a little differently. So I hope you'll look at this. These are all from 1 to 2:30 on those days, and if you've signed up for this, you have the information about signing up for one of the other ones, and we hope that some of you will join us for some additional training that we have provided this December. Once again, this is brought to you by the New York State Coalition for the Aging, which is a statewide organization that supports providers of services to older people and their caregivers throughout New York State, as well as the New York State Association of Area Agencies on Aging. And I want to thank, again, Karen Thornton from the New York State Association of Area Agencies on Aging for the technical support provided today. And please stay on the line stay connected to your computer for a few minutes at the end of our session, because there will be a survey that will pop up, a very short one that will help us identify how this went and what else might be of interest to you in training for the future. So thanks again to Frank and all of you for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.